The gun was already drawn when she walked through the door. Sheriff Harrison Odell had his Colt Army revolver leveled at the man's chest before the saloon doors finished swinging, and the whole of Dry Creek, Texas went silent in that particular way it did when death was close enough to smell. Dust motes hung in the late afternoon light. A piano player 3 tables back stopped mid-note. Every man in that room held his breath and looked between the sheriff and the stranger he had pinned against the bar with nothing but his cold, gray stare and the barrel of that gun. Nobody breathed. And then a small hand closed around Harrison Odell's gun hand, not grabbing, not pulling. Just resting there, warm and impossibly light, 5 tiny fingers curling around his weathered knuckles the way a bird lands on a fence post, without warning, without fear, as if it had every right in the world to be there. He looked down. A girl, no more than 4 years old, stood beside him in a dress that had been washed so many times the blue had nearly gone white. She had dark curls and enormous brown eyes, and she was looking up at him with the kind of absolute, guileless trust that most grown men would have flinched away from. She was not afraid of the gun. She was not afraid of the tension in the room or the dead weight of violence pressing against every wall. She was just looking at him, and her hand was on his, and something in Harrison Odell's chest cracked clean down the middle. He had not been touched like that in 6 years. The stranger at the bar cleared his throat. Harrison did not move the gun. But the hand on his knuckles had already done something irreversible, something he could not have anticipated on his worst day, something that broke through every wall he had built since the day they buried his wife and his future in the same red dirt outside of Austin. A woman's voice came from just behind the child. "Clara," sharp, frightened. "Clara, come here right now." The little girl did not come. She kept her hand exactly where it was, on the sheriff's gun hand, and she tilted her head at him the way children do, when they are trying to understand something enormous with their very small hearts. And Harrison Odell, the man they called the Cold Sheriff, the man who had not smiled in 6 years and had not allowed himself a single moment of softness in longer than that, slowly, almost involuntarily, lowered the gun. The whole room let out its breath. The woman behind Clara rushed forward, scooping the child up so fast the little girl let out a startled sound, and Harrison finally turned to look at her. She was young, late 20s maybe, with dark hair pushed back under a travel bonnet that had seen better days. Her eyes were the deep brown of river water in autumn, and they were looking at him with an expression he could not immediately name. It was somewhere between terror and relief and something else entirely. "I am so sorry," she said. "She got away from me. I am so sorry." Harrison holstered his gun. He looked at the little girl in her arms who was watching him over her mother's shoulder with those enormous eyes, and he felt the crack in his chest widen. He turned back to the stranger at the bar. "Get out of Dry Creek," he said quietly, "and do not come back." The stranger went. The saloon returned to its noise. The piano started up again. Boots shuffled across the floorboards and glasses clinked, and the hot Texas afternoon reasserted itself over everything. But Harrison Odell stood in the middle of it all and felt, for the first time in 6 years, like something had shifted beneath the earth he was standing on. He did not know yet that the woman with the river water eyes was named Olivia Grant. He did not know she was running from something that made the stranger at the bar look like a minor inconvenience. He did not know that her little girl's name was Clara, or that Clara had an instinct for people that her mother had spent 4 years trying to understand. He did not know any of it yet. But the warmth of those small fingers on his hand would not leave him, and he suspected, with the quiet, reluctant certainty of a man who had learned to trust his instincts over everything else, that his life was about to become considerably less cold. It had been 6 years since Harrison Odell came to Dry Creek. He had arrived the winter after his wife, Catherine, died of fever in Austin, leaving him with nothing but a badge he had already been wearing for 3 years, and a grief so complete it had reorganized every single thing about who he was. He had requested the transfer himself. Dry Creek was remote, barely a town, sitting at the edge of Comanche County in West Texas, where the scrub brush went on forever, and the nearest neighboring settlement was a day's hard ride in any direction. It was the kind of place where a man could do his work without being bothered to be human. He had been good at the job, better than good. In 6 years, he had cleaned out 2 outlaw operations, negotiated a land dispute that nearly turned into a range war, and maintained a kind of iron order in the town that the merchants and ranchers appreciated, even if they were frightened of the man who enforced it. He was fair. He was fast when he needed to be. He never took a bribe and he never looked the other way, and the men who had tried to corrupt or intimidate him had all found out, one way or another, that there was nothing in Harrison Odell that could be moved by threats. He lived alone in the small house attached to the jailhouse. He cooked his own meals, which were functional and joyless. He kept the place clean. He read law books in the evenings and occasionally the newspaper when it made it out this far. He did not visit the saloon except in a professional capacity. He did not court anyone. He had never so much as taken a Sunday meal with a local family, and every widow and hopeful young woman in Dry Creek had long since accepted that the sheriff was a closed door and was likely to remain one. He was 32 years old, and he had made his peace with emptiness. That was the story Harrison Odell told himself every morning when he strapped on his gun belt. He was still telling it to himself the following morning when he walked into Me Fletcher's dry goods store to pick up the coffee and salt he ordered every 2 weeks, and found Olivia Grant already at the counter, counting out coins with the careful, quiet concentration of a woman who was checking every cent twice. The little girl, Clara, was sitting on the floor beside a barrel of dried beans, talking to a rag doll she was holding upright against the barrel as if it were another person sitting across from her at dinner. Harrison stepped through the door and the bell above it rang, and Clara looked up immediately. Her face split into an open, uncomplicated smile, and she climbed to her feet and crossed the floor to him before her mother had even registered his presence. She stood directly in front of him and looked up. He looked down. "Hello," she said. He had not been greeted with that kind of direct, uncalculated warmth in so long he almost did not know what to do with it. He cleared his throat. "Hello," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Olivia turned from the counter and the color came into her face immediately. She crossed the floor in 3 quick steps and took Clara's hand. "I am sorry." She tends to walk right up to people. She glanced up at him and then away. "We are leaving town today. I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday and to apologize again." "No need for apology," Harrison said, which was more words than he generally used at once with strangers. Me Fletcher, who had been running the dry goods store for 20 years and had watched Harrison Odell buy his coffee and salt with the wordless efficiency of a man who had given up on conversation, was watching all of this with barely concealed fascination. "Mrs. Grant was just asking me about available rooms," Me said, with the particular brightness of a woman inserting herself usefully. "I was telling her about the Ketterman house." "We are just passing through," Olivia said quickly. "To where?" Me asked pleasantly. The question sat in the air for a moment. Harrison watched Olivia's face and saw something move through it, something practiced, a response that had been readied and then unexpectedly failed her. She looked down at Clara, and when she looked back up, There was something honest in her expression that had not been there before. "I have not entirely decided yet," she said. Harrison collected his coffee and salt, paid me, and was at the door before something made him stop. He did not analyze the impulse. He simply turned. "The Ketterman house is available," he said to Olivia. "Walt Ketterman died last spring. His daughter moved to San Antonio. It needs work, but the roof holds." He paused. "If you need somewhere to land." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. There was wariness in it, the kind that had been built up over time and not by accident, but there was also something else, a careful measuring, a weighing of information. She was intelligent. He could see that immediately. "How much does it rent for?" she asked. $4 a month. "I can speak to Thomas Carey. He handles the property." "Thank you, Sheriff." She said it with her chin up, with a dignity that was quiet but absolute. "I will think about it." He nodded and left. Clara, watching from her mother's side, waved at him through the window as he walked past. He almost did not see it, but he did. He told himself it did not mean anything. He was still telling himself that 3 days later when Olivia Grant moved into the Ketterman house. She had done it herself, mostly. By the time Harrison walked past on his morning rounds, she had already swept the front porch and hung a clean curtain in the front window. And Clara was in the small front yard, digging in the dry earth with a stick with the purposeful joy of someone who had been given, briefly, a piece of ground to call their own. Harrison kept walking. That evening, Mrs. Rosa Garza, from 2 doors down, came to him while he was locking up the jail office and told him, in her forthright way, that the new woman was alone and clearly skilled, but that the back window frame was so rotten it would fall in with the first autumn wind. "And she has a small child," Rosa said, as if this settled the matter. "I will speak to Thomas Carey about repairs," Harrison said. Rosa looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 4 years, with a kind of patient exasperation that he had never given her cause to abandon. "I was not suggesting you speak to Thomas Carey," she said. "He went the next morning with a replacement window frame he had pulled from the back of the jail's storage room, and his own tool kit, which he kept in better order than most people kept their households. He knocked at the front door, and Olivia opened it in an apron, her hair half loose from its arrangement, and she looked at him and at the window frame under his arm and did not say anything for a moment. "Rosa Garza mentioned the back window," he said. "I was going to speak to Mr. Carey about it. He will charge you extra for the winter repair." She looked at the window frame again and then stepped back. "All right, thank you." He went around to the back and worked for an hour in the cool morning. Clara appeared and sat on the back step in her nightgown and watched him with the same focused attention she gave everything, including, apparently, a sheriff replacing a window frame. She asked him after a while whether he had a dog. "No," he said. "We had a dog in Missouri," she said. "His name was Captain." He did not know what to say to this, so he said nothing. Clara did not seem to require a response. She told him, in the companionable, unprompted way of small children, that Captain had been brown with one white ear, that her mother had cried when they left him behind, and that she herself had given him all of her crackers the last morning so he would not be hungry. The image of Olivia Grant crying over a dog while she packed her child, and whatever she could carry into whatever had brought her from Missouri to the far edge of West Texas, sat in Harrison's chest in a way that was not comfortable. "What brought you to Dry Creek?" he asked, without planning to. Clara considered this seriously. "Mama said we needed somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere nobody would bother us." He was still thinking about that when Olivia came out with coffee, 2 cups, and set them on the back step without being asked. She sat on the far end of the step from Clara and wrapped her hands around her own cup and looked at the flat, scrubby horizon that Dry Creek offered in every direction. "You do not have to do this," she said. "The window—" "I know," Harrison said. She looked at him. He kept working. After a moment, she said, "Clara likes you." He glanced at the little girl, who had moved off the step and was now very carefully examining a lizard that had appeared on the fence post. "I noticed," he said. "She does not take to most people," Olivia said. "She is usually very shy." He did not know what to do with that information either. He finished the window frame and tested it twice, and then stood and collected his tools. Clara had moved back to the step and was watching him with those enormous eyes. "All done?" she asked. "All done," he said. She beamed at him. He told himself, walking back down the dusty main street of Dry Creek in the sharp October morning, that he had done a neighborly thing. That was all. He was the sheriff. He looked after the people in his town. The problem was that he had not looked after the people in his town in quite this way before. Not personally. Not with his own hands and his own tools. Not with coffee on back steps and the sound of a child's voice in the morning air. Something had cracked open in him, and the light was getting in whether he wanted it to or not. Olivia Grant, as the town of Dry Creek learned over the following weeks, was not a woman who sat still and waited for things to come to her. She had a skill with a needle that was immediately apparent to anyone who saw her work, and within 2 weeks of arriving, she had placed a small, careful notice at the dry goods store offering alterations and dressmaking. By the end of the 3rd week, she had 3 clients. By the end of the 1st month, she had more work than she could comfortably manage. She also, Harrison observed in his professionally detached and absolutely not personally interested way, had a talent for getting on with people. She was not loud or pushing about it. She was simply direct and warm and honest. And the women of Dry Creek, who had been watching her cautiously the way small towns watched newcomers, began one by one to bring her their mending and to stay a little longer than strictly necessary. Clara attended lessons with the other children in the schoolroom above the church, where a young woman named Miss Polly Vance taught reading and arithmetic. Clara, Miss Vance informed Harrison when he encountered her outside the church one afternoon in a completely unrelated matter regarding a noise complaint from next door, was extremely bright and asked more questions than any child she had ever taught. "She asked me yesterday," Miss Vance said, with the slightly dazed look of someone who had been comprehensively outpaced by a 4-year-old, "why the sky does not fall down." Harrison nearly smiled. He caught it before it became visible, or at least he thought he did, but Miss Vance looked at him as if she had seen something remarkable. He took his evening rounds more slowly these days. He told himself it was because the autumn made the light difficult and the shadows needed more watching. He told himself a great many things. The truth was that the Ketterman house now had that front curtain in the window, and in the evenings there was a soft lamp glow behind it, and occasionally Clara's shadow moving across it, and once, just once, the faint sound of Olivia singing something so low and private that Harrison had stopped walking and stood in the dusty street like a man who had just remembered something he had forgotten for years. He forced himself to keep moving. He had not felt anything for a woman since Catherine died. He had been very deliberate about that. He had held his grief like a debt he owed her, and the coldness that had followed was the only way he knew to honor it. It seemed to him, in the clear but somewhat dishonest logic of men who are protecting themselves, that to feel anything again would be a betrayal of what they had had. That Catherine's memory deserved his emptiness. That love was a thing that happened once and when it ended, took everything with it. He had built a whole life around that belief. He had not counted on a 4-year-old with her mother's brown eyes and no fear in the world. It was the 3rd week of October when Deputy Ned Carver came to Harrison's office in the early morning with a look on his face that Harrison recognized as the particular expression of a man delivering bad news. Ned was 24 and eager and reliable in the ways that mattered, and he was genuinely reluctant as he sat down and said, "Boss, I heard something at the saloon last night I think you need to know." Harrison set down his coffee. "Tell me." "There were 2 men came through last night." "Passing trade, I thought. But I heard them asking about the woman, the new seamstress. The Grant woman." Ned paused. "They had a paper, like a description. They were asking if anyone had seen a woman matching it." The room went very quiet in the particular way Harrison's mind went quiet when something dangerous entered his field of consideration. "What kind of men?" he asked. "Not lawmen," Ned said. "They did not have badges. They were dressed like hired hands, but they were not ranching men. Too clean for that and too careful. The way they talked," he paused. "The way they were asking questions, like it was a job." Harrison was already standing. "Where did they go?" "They took rooms at the Mercer boarding house for the night. I saw the light on when I came in an hour ago, so they are still there." Harrison put on his hat. "Get the description of their horses and write it down. And Ned, do not say anything to anyone about this." He went out into the cold morning. He did not go to the boarding house first. He went to the Ketterman house. The lamp was already lit in the kitchen, and through the front window he could see the silhouette of Olivia moving around in her morning routine, Clara presumably still asleep in the back room. He knocked. She came to the door in her housecoat with her hair down, and her eyes alert the way eyes are when they have been expecting a knock like this for some time and not knowing when it would come. She looked at him, and her face went through several things at once. She did not say good morning. She said, "How many?" He looked at her for a moment. "2, at the Mercer boarding house. Do you know why they would be looking for you?" She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He went in. She closed the door and stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, and something in her expression that was not fear exactly, though there was fear in it. It was more like a person who has been running for a long time and has finally had to stop and turn around. "My husband," she said. "My former husband, Charles Grant. He is not willing to accept that I left." Harrison waited. "We were married in St. Louis in 1874. Clara was born in 1877. I left in the spring of this year." She said it flatly, with the careful flatness of someone who has reduced a very long and complicated story to its most essential points. "He is a wealthy man. He has connections. When I left, I took Clara and I took nothing else, because I knew that any money I took would give him grounds to pursue me legally, and I was not willing to give him that." She looked at Harrison steadily. "I am not a runaway wife looking for adventure. I am a woman who needed to get her daughter somewhere safe." "Did he hurt you?" Harrison asked, and was surprised by the directness of his own question. Her jaw tightened. "He is the kind of man who does not leave marks," she said. He understood. He had been a lawman long enough to understand exactly what she meant, and the cold, controlled anger that moved through him at her words was something he recognized as professional experience, but also, now, something more than that. "The 2 men," he said. "They came to bring you back, or to establish your location and report back." "Probably the second," she said. "He would want to know where I am before he acts. He is methodical." She said the word with a particular quality that told him it had been, at one point, something she had admired about Charles Grant and had since revised entirely. "All right," Harrison said. "Here is what I am going to do." He went to the Mercer boarding house and had a conversation with the 2 men that was brief, direct, and unambiguous. He informed them that he was the sheriff of Dry Creek, that his jurisdiction was clear, and that without a lawful warrant they had no authority to detain, question, or relocate any resident of his town. He also informed them, with the quiet certainty of a man who had never once in his professional life been successfully threatened, that if they were found within the limits of Dry Creek after noon that day, he would hold them on suspicion of intent to intimidate a local citizen, which was not precisely a legal category he had invented on the spot, but was close enough to several real ones that the two men looked at each other and decided they had other places to be. They were gone before 10. Harrison told Ned, who was deeply satisfied by this outcome. Then he went about his regular business, which included a fence dispute between two ranchers and a matter involving a stray horse that had eaten through someone's kitchen garden. He did not go back to the Ketterman house. He thought about going back all day. In the evening, Rosa Garza came and told him that Mrs. Grant had brought her a piece of apple cake with a note that said thank you, which was apparently how Olivia had chosen to communicate what she had been unable to say in person that morning. Rosa reported this to Harrison with the expression of a woman who was enjoying herself considerably. Harrison ate the apple cake that Rosa had very deliberately brought along for him, and he stared at the ceiling of his office for a long time. He did not know what to do with tenderness. He had forgotten the shape of it. November came in hard and cold, the way West Texas Novembers did, with a wind that cut through everything and a sky that went gray and stayed there. The town pulled inward the way small towns did in cold weather, everyone visiting a little more, sitting a little closer to fires, relying on neighbors with the practical warmth of people who understood that community was not sentiment but survival. Harrison found himself, with increasing frequency, in proximity to Olivia Grant in ways that were entirely appropriate and explainable, but that he was no longer convincing himself were accidental. He repaired the front gate of the Ketterman house when he noticed it leaning. He brought, once, a bundle of firewood that the supplier had left at the jail by mistake, or so he told himself, though the supplier had not been to the jail that week. Clara, for her part, had adopted him with the serene completeness of someone who had made a decision, and saw no reason to revisit it. She greeted him by name now, with great confidence, and had taken to saving him things she found that she thought he might like, a particularly smooth stone, a feather that had properties she explained in grave detail, once a piece of hard candy from Miss Polly's Friday reward that she had wrapped very carefully in a scrap of paper and kept until Monday to give him. He kept the stone and the feather. He felt ridiculous about both. He also felt something warm and aching and very old in the part of him that had gone cold. He and Catherine had not had children. They had wanted them. The wanting had been one of the things they had held carefully between them, the hope of it, the future shape of a family. And then Catherine was gone, and the wanting had no place to go, and he had packed it so deep he had ceased to be aware of it. Clara was making him aware of it. It was a Sunday afternoon in the middle of November, when Harrison finally stopped lying to himself. He had just walked Olivia and Clara home from the church service, which he attended himself most Sundays out of a sense of civic responsibility and not for any other reason. And Clara had insisted on holding his hand the entire way, which he had permitted, because arguing with Clara was like arguing with the weather. They had stood on the front porch of the Ketterman house, and Olivia had thanked him for the walk, and he had nodded and turned to go, and she had said quietly, just before he stepped off the porch, "Harrison." It was the first time she had used his first name. He stopped. "Would you like to come in for supper?" she asked. "Nothing elaborate, just what I have." He stood with his back to her for one full second, long enough to understand that this was a door, and that once he walked through it there would be no more useful fiction about window frames and firewood and civic responsibility. Then he turned around. "Yes," he said, "I would." Supper was pork and beans and cornbread, and it was better than anything he had eaten in 6 years because he had not eaten with anyone else in 6 years. And because the table had Clara at it, with her rag doll propped up beside her, and a very serious discussion with her mother about whether the doll, whose name was apparently Rosie, should be allowed at the table as a general rule. He sat across from Olivia and watched her laugh at something Clara said, her whole face open and light for a moment, and he felt the last wall go. Not crumble slowly, as he had been thinking would happen, but go, all at once, the way a locked door goes when you finally find the key. He was in love with her. He was fairly certain he had been heading there since the moment a tiny hand rested on his gun hand in the Dry Creek saloon, and that all the window frames and firewood in the world had been him trying to find a way towards something he did not know yet how to ask for. He helped with the dishes without being asked. Clara fell asleep in her chair before the table was cleared, and Olivia carried her to bed with the ease of long practice. And when she came back, she found Harrison standing in the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder. And she stopped in the doorway and looked at him, and something passed between them that was neither of them quite ready to say out loud yet. "She asks about you," Olivia said finally. "When you are not here, where is the sheriff, that kind of thing." "She asked me last week if I knew how to whistle," Harrison said. "I told her yes, and she required an immediate demonstration." Olivia laughed. She sat down at the kitchen table, and Harrison set the last cup on the shelf and turned around, and they looked at each other across the small, warm kitchen. "I have not been good at trusting men," she said. It was a simple statement, without accusation or apology, just a fact laid on the table. "I know," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that." "I appreciate it," he said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I have not been good at much of anything since my wife died," he said, which was also a fact, not an apology. "I became something very close to a stone." She looked at him with those river water eyes. "You have not seemed like a stone to me," she said quietly. "Not once, not even the first day." "Clara may be responsible for that," he said. "I think she saw something that was already there," Olivia said. "She usually does." They sat at that kitchen table for another hour, talking. Not about anything particularly weighty, about Missouri and Texas and the differences between them, about what she had done before she married, which was work in her mother's dressmaking shop in St. Louis, about what he had done before he became a lawman, which was ranch work on his father's land in the hill country until his father's death, about books they had both read, about the particular quality of West Texas light. It was the most Harrison Odell had talked to another person in 6 years, and he found, to his surprise, that he had not forgotten how. He walked home in the cold November dark and looked up at the sky, which was extravagant with stars the way West Texas skies were in winter, and felt something he had not felt in so long he needed a moment to identify it. He felt happy. It was fragile and tentative, and he did not trust it yet. But it was there. The problem was that Charles Grant was not the kind of man who sent 2 hired hands and accepted their failure as a conclusion. Harrison knew this without being told. He had dealt with enough wealthy, controlling men to know that the pattern they followed was reliable as weather, a small test, a failure, and then the decision to come themselves with something more definitive. He had been watching for it, quietly, for weeks, and he had written to a colleague in St. Louis to see what he could find out about Charles Grant. The reply came in the second week of November, and it was thorough, and it made Harrison sit in his office for a long time with the letter in his hand. Charles Grant was 41 years old, wealthy by inheritance and expanded by business, and had a reputation in St. Louis's better circles as a man of fierce respectability. He had influence. He had a lawyer. He had, according to Harrison's source, recently filed papers in a St. Louis court claiming abandonment and seeking custody of his daughter. Custody of Clara. Harrison read that line 3 times. He went to Olivia that evening and laid it before her without softening it, because she was not a woman who needed to be protected from information. She needed the information. She sat very still while he talked, her hands flat on the table, her face arranged in the careful stillness of someone using every bit of their composure. When he finished, she said, "He cannot take her. She is my daughter." "He has money and a lawyer," Harrison said. "And a St. Louis court that does not know you," he paused. "You need a lawyer too." "I cannot afford a lawyer. I know one in Austin who will work on credit. He is good. His name is Robert Vetch, and he owes me a favor." He watched her face. "He can file a response to Grant's petition and establish your residence here. Texas courts are separate from Missouri courts. It will not be simple, but it will not be nothing either." She looked at him for a long time. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question. He thought about answering carefully and decided against it. "Because I care what happens to you," he said, "and to Clara." The silence was full and warm. "Harrison," she said, and then she stopped, as if she had reached the edge of what she was ready to say. "You do not have to say anything," he said quietly. "I want to," she said. She looked at her hands. "I have not let myself care about anyone in a long time. It seemed like a door I needed to keep closed." She looked up. "I am not sure I can keep it closed anymore." He held very still, the way a man holds still when something he has been waiting for without naming it is standing right in front of him. "I am not in any hurry," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, just briefly, just for a moment. And he turned his hand over so that his fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. Outside the window, the West Texas night was cold and enormous and full of stars. Robert Vetch arrived from Austin in the last week of November. A small, precise man with sharp eyes and an economy of words that Harrison respected. He sat with Olivia for 2 hours while Harrison waited in the front room, and Clara drew careful pictures at his knee with a piece of chalk on a slate, informing him periodically of what she was drawing, which included a horse, a house, and him, the last rendered with a hat so large it occupied most of the composition. When Vetch came out, he spoke to them both, which Olivia had asked him to do. "The Missouri petition is legally shaky," he said. "He filed on abandonment, but she took the child with her, which he knows, and which means he is using the courts as a pressure tool rather than a genuine legal strategy. He wants her to feel cornered and come back." He looked at Olivia. "The Texas filing will re-establish your legal residence and put Clara under Texas jurisdiction. Grant would have to bring his case here, in front of a Texas judge, and he would not find it as sympathetic a room." "Is there anything he can actually do?" Olivia asked. "He can make it difficult," Vetch said honestly. "He has money for lawyers. He can file and refile and cause you legal inconvenience for some time, but it would cost him more than it would gain him eventually, and a man like that knows it. What he is counting on is that you will not have the resources to fight back." Olivia straightened. "He miscalculated," she said, and there was something in her voice that was quiet and absolute. Harrison looked at her and felt, again, that crack down the middle of his chest. Not grief this time, but something its opposite. Vetch left the following morning with the papers he needed, and a fee arrangement that Harrison had quietly supplemented, a fact he had not mentioned to Olivia and did not intend to. It was his town and its people were his responsibility. He told himself that too, but with less conviction than he once had. Charles Grant arrived in Dry Creek on a Thursday afternoon in early December, in a hired coach from the rail station at Midland, and he was everything Harrison had expected: tall, well-dressed, with the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to every room he entered adjusting itself to him. He had a lawyer with him, a man named Fillmore who had the practiced smoothness of someone paid to handle difficult situations. Harrison was at the coach before it fully stopped. He introduced himself. He made his jurisdiction clear. He made it equally clear that he had read the Missouri petition, was aware of the Texas filing, and that any attempt to remove Clara Grant from the custody of her mother without a valid Texas court order would be treated as kidnapping, regardless of any prior or pending legal proceedings in any other state. Grant looked at him with the cool assessment of a man who was deciding how much of an obstacle Harrison actually represented. "I have legal rights to my daughter," he said. "You have a petition in a Missouri court that has not been adjudicated," Harrison said. "That is not the same thing. You are welcome to stay in Dry Creek and consult with your lawyer. But if you approach Mrs. Grant or her daughter without a valid court order, I will arrest you. I want to be clear about that." Grant's jaw tightened. "This is not the last you have heard of this," he said. "I expect not," Harrison said. "Have a good afternoon." He did not watch the coach go to the boarding house. He walked directly to the Ketterman house and found Olivia already at the window, having seen the coach come in, her face pale and composed. "He is here," Harrison said. "I know." She looked at Clara, who was in the back room and had not seen anything. "Is there anything I need to do?" "Stay calm. Do not go near him. Let Vetch handle the legal side." He paused. "And trust me to handle everything else." She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed through her face that was complex and deep, and he did not have words for it, except that it was trust, real and hard-won trust, and it meant more to him than almost anything she could have said. "I do trust you," she said. "That is what I have been trying to adjust to." He stayed that evening. Not past what was proper, but through supper and through Clara's bedtime. And when Clara was put to bed, she called for Harrison to come say good night, which he did, standing in the doorway of the small back room, and Clara reached up and patted his hand with her small palm and said, "You will be here tomorrow." Something in his throat constricted. "Yes," he said, "I will be here tomorrow." "Good," she said with enormous satisfaction, and closed her eyes. He walked back out to the kitchen and found Olivia leaning against the counter with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes bright with something she was holding carefully. "She loves you," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "The feeling is mutual." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning, and outside the wind moved across the flat West Texas dark. And Harrison Odell, who had been a closed door for 6 years, walked across the kitchen and stood in front of Olivia Grant and said, very simply, "I love you." I want to say that plainly so there is no uncertainty about where I stand. Her breath went in sharp. "I am not asking you for anything immediately," he said. "I know this is complicated and there is still the matter of Grant and the legal question and all the rest of it. I am just telling you because you deserve to know what is true." She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very bright. "Harrison," she said, and her voice was low and a little unsteady, "I am trying so hard not to cry, and I want you to know that is entirely your fault." He found, to his own considerable surprise, that the corners of his mouth were doing something they had not done in a very long time. He was smiling, not the half-there, politely managed thing that passed for a smile sometimes, but a real one, helpless and warm. "I love you too," she said. "I have been loving you since you brought that window frame around the back of my house at 7 in the morning. I have been fighting it because I was afraid of it. She looked at him steadily. I am done fighting it. He took her hand, the same way her daughter had once taken his, carefully and with absolute certainty. All right, he said. Then we figure out the rest together. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder for just a moment, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the lamplight while the wind moved outside and Clara slept in the back room, and the world was very small and very warm. Grant's lawyer filed for a Texas court, hearing at the county seat in Midland the following week. It was, as Robert Vetch had predicted, more pressure than legitimate legal strategy, but it required a response and it required Olivia to be present. And that meant a 2-day journey to Midland in December, which was not comfortable by any calculation. Harrison arranged it. He went with them himself, which caused Ned Carver to run things in his absence, and which caused the whole of Dry Creek to form very clear opinions about the nature of his relationship with the Grant woman. Opinions they expressed to each other over fences, and in the dry goods store with the energetic interest that small towns took in such things. The hearing was anticlimactic in the way that good legal preparation makes things anticlimactic. Vetch had filed comprehensively. The Texas judge was a direct man named Hollies who had no patience for out-of-state legal maneuvers and made this clear. He looked at Grant's petition, looked at Vetch's response, looked at Olivia and at Clara, who had been brought along because there was no one to leave her with and who sat beside her mother with her rag doll, and examined the judge with frank interest. Judge Hollies asked Olivia several direct questions. She answered them directly. He asked Clara, with the careful gentleness that some older men reserved for small children, if she was happy living with her mother in Dry Creek. Clara looked at him very seriously and said, "Yes." And the sheriff fixed our window. There was a silence in the courtroom. Judge Hollies' face did something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He looked at Harrison, who was sitting in the back of the room and who kept his expression entirely neutral. The hearing took less than 2 hours. Grant's petition was denied. Texas jurisdiction was affirmed. Olivia was recognized as Clara's legal guardian under Texas law, and the judge made it clear that any further attempts to relitigate the matter without substantial new grounds would not be welcomed in his courtroom. Grant met Harrison's eyes across the courtroom as he left, and Harrison held his gaze without expression. Grant looked away first. He and his lawyer boarded the return stage the following morning, and Harrison never saw either of them in Dry Creek again. Vetch sent a letter 3 weeks later informing Olivia that Grant had withdrawn the Missouri petition as well. The legal matter was, to all measurable purposes, closed. Olivia read the letter at the kitchen table while Clara was at school and Harrison sat across from her, and when she finished, she set it down and put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just releasing something that had been held very tight for a very long time. He reached across and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he confirmed. She looked up and her face was clear and open in a way he had not seen before, a way that told him she had been carrying this weight even in her happiest moments and had not put it down until now. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Well," Harrison said carefully, "I have been thinking about that." She looked at him. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I would like to court you properly, formally, if that is agreeable to you." He was aware that this was not the most poetic declaration ever made in the history of such things, but he meant every word of it with complete sincerity, and she knew him well enough to know that. She smiled, and the smile reached all the way into those river water eyes, and she said, "I have been waiting for you to ask." Christmas came to Dry Creek with the particular quality of a West Texas December. Cold nights and hard, clear days, and the smell of cedar from the wreaths that Rosa Garza and several other women put up in the shop windows. The church organized a celebration, and there was singing and a ham supper, and the children performed a small pageant in which Clara was assigned the role of an angel, a casting that the town unanimously agreed was appropriate. Harrison sat beside Olivia in the church pew, not touching, because they were in public, and he was not a demonstrative man by nature, and she understood this about him. But their shoulders were close enough that warmth passed between them, and once, during the singing, she looked over at him sideways and he looked back and they both looked away and said nothing, and the current of it was strong and steady and absolutely clear. Clara, in her angel costume, spotted them from the stage and waved with both hands. Several people in the congregation laughed. Olivia put her hand over her face. Harrison permitted himself a full smile, which Rosa Garza, sitting 2 rows back, noted with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for it for a very long time. He had bought Clara a gift, a small carved horse he had made himself over several evenings in his office when things were quiet, sanded smooth and painted brown with one white ear. Olivia had seen him working on it once when she stopped by with his supper, a habit they had established over the past month, and she had recognized what it was and had not said anything, only looked at him with an expression that told him she understood exactly what he meant by it. On Christmas morning, Clara opened it and stared at it for a long moment and then looked up at Harrison with enormous eyes. "He has a white ear," she said. "He does," Harrison confirmed. She held it against her chest with both arms. "His name is Captain," she said. Harrison did not trust himself to speak for a moment. He looked at Olivia, who was watching him with those bright river water eyes, and he reached over and took her hand under the table, simply and naturally, and she held it back with equal simplicity. It was the best Christmas he had had in 6 years. He asked her to marry him in January, on a cold afternoon with the light coming through the kitchen window at the angle that made the room look like something a painter would stop to look at. He had thought about it at length, which was his nature, but when the moment came it was not a long speech. He told her he loved her and that he wanted to spend his life with her, and that he wanted to be Clara's father, if she would allow it, in whatever way felt right and honest. Olivia said yes before he was finished, and then she laughed, a real full laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, and she put her hands on his face and kissed him, which was the first time she had kissed him, and it was warm and certain and everything he had almost stopped hoping for. They were married in March, in the Dry Creek Church, on a Sunday afternoon with the whole town in attendance, because there was no realistic way to have a wedding in a town that size without the whole town being in attendance, and also because everybody wanted to come. Rosa Garza cried openly and without apology. Ned Carver polished his boots for the occasion. Miss Polly Vance brought flowers from whatever she could find blooming this early. Clara was the self-appointed flower carrier, a role she took with extreme seriousness, walking very slowly down the aisle with a small basket of dried wildflowers, and depositing them with great care and ceremony, pausing to beam at various members of the congregation along the way. Harrison stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which he had purchased specifically for this occasion, and watched his future wife walk toward him down the aisle with Clara's hand in hers, and he felt the last of the cold leave him. It was not a gradual departure. It was complete. Like a winter that ends. Olivia came to stand beside him and looked up at him, and he looked back at her and Reverend James cleared his throat and began. The words of the ceremony washed over Harrison like water, and he heard them, but mostly he was aware of her hand in his and the warmth of it. and the smell of the flowers Polly Vance had brought, and the sound of Clara's whispered comment to Rosa Garza that she could not hear from where she was standing. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, he did, briefly and with the restrained certainty of a man who was saving the more complete expression of his feelings for somewhere private. Dry Creek cheered. They had a supper at the town hall that lasted until well past dark, which was longer than most events in Dry Creek lasted, because the fiddle player kept going, and people kept dancing, and nobody wanted to be the first to leave. Harrison danced twice, which surprised everyone including himself, once with Rosa Garza and once with Clara, who required him to carry her for most of it because her feet were tired but who nonetheless considered herself to be dancing. He and Olivia walked home through the cold March night with Clara asleep between them, her arms around both their necks, her face pressed against Harrison's shoulder. He could feel her weight and the warmth of her, and he thought about the first time she had put her hand on his, in the Dry Creek saloon in October, before he knew either of them, when she had reached for him with the absolute instinctive trust of a child who had seen something worth trusting. He thought that if he had to identify a single moment when his life changed direction, it would be that one. Not a gun drawn in a saloon, not legal papers or hired men, not the cold and the grief and all the years of iron emptiness. Just a small hand on his, warm and certain. Just a child who looked at him and saw something worth reaching for. He carried Clara inside and put her to bed while Olivia stood in the doorway of the small room, watching him do it with an expression so full of quiet love that it was almost unbearable to look at directly. He pulled the quilt up over Clara's shoulders, and she stirred slightly and said, without opening her eyes, "Papa." It was the first time she had called him that. He stilled completely. Olivia's breath caught in the doorway. Clara was already fully asleep. Harrison straightened up slowly, and he did not trust himself to look at Olivia immediately. So he looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at his hands, and then he let himself look at her. She was against the door frame with her hand over her mouth and her eyes very bright. He crossed the room and put his arms around her and held her for a long time, right there in the doorway of their daughter's room. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. Spring came to West Texas in the particular way it did, sudden and extravagant, the scrub country flowering with things you would not expect it to have in it. Yellows and purples and pinks all at once. The sky going enormous and blue after months of gray. Harrison had never paid much attention to it before. He found he was paying attention now. He and Olivia had settled into a life together that was everything he had stopped believing in and nothing he had planned for. The house was different with them in it. There was warmth and disorder and the sound of Clara's voice and laughter, and sometimes argument, and the smell of Olivia's cooking and the sense, constant and astonishing, that someone was there. He had not understood until now how much the absence of that had cost him. He kept his job, which he was good at and which was necessary. The town was his responsibility and he took it seriously. But he came home at the end of the day now, and home was a real thing, a warm and inhabited place, and the act of coming back to it changed everything about the going out. Clara started calling him Papa consistently, and then it became simply what she called him, and the town of Dry Creek absorbed this fact with the same quiet warmth with which they had absorbed the whole story, not without commentary, because nothing in Dry Creek was without commentary, but with a fundamental goodwill that was one of the things Harrison had never quite admitted he valued about the place he had chosen to disappear into 6 years ago. He taught Clara to whistle in April, a project she approached with tremendous determination over many afternoons, and when she finally got it right, She whistled the same two-note sequence approximately 400 times in a single afternoon, with the relentless joy of someone who has mastered a great skill. He and Olivia sat on the porch in the spring evening listening to it, and Olivia was leaning against him with her head on his shoulder, and he had his arm around her. And the sunset was doing what West Texas sunsets did, which was everything, all the colors at once, reckless and enormous. "Are you happy?" she asked. He considered the question with the same careful honesty he gave to everything. "Yes," he said. "I am." He paused. "More than I knew how to be." She tilted her head up and looked at him. "I never thought I would feel safe again," she said quietly. "Real safety. The kind that comes from trusting someone." He looked at her. "You are safe," he said. "That is a promise." She kissed him on the jaw, which was her particular way, brief and warm and certain. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them and announced that she had whistled so much that now her mouth was tired. And was there any supper? There was supper. The summer was long and hot and fine. Clara grew noticeably, a fact that delighted her and made Olivia look at her sometimes with an expression that was joy and grief at once. The way parents looked at children who were doing what children were supposed to do, becoming themselves. Her questions became more sophisticated, and her understanding of the world around her deepened with every week. And she was interested in everything with an intensity that kept everyone around her on their toes. She asked Harrison one afternoon, with the directness that had characterized her from the beginning, why he had a scar on the back of his hand. He looked at the scar. "A man with a knife," he said, without drama. Clara considered this seriously. "Did you stop him?" "I did." She nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to what she was doing, which was attempting to braid her doll Rosie's yarn hair. "Good," she said. He thought sometimes about how much of his life he had spent being a man who stopped bad things, and how this had at some point become the whole of him. The stopping, the preventing, the maintaining of order against the forces that would disrupt it. He had been good at it, but he had been hollow at the center of it. He was not hollow now. There was something at the center now, warm and specific and irreplaceable. In October, a year after Olivia and Clara arrived in Dry Creek, Harrison came home on a Tuesday evening to find Olivia at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, and an expression that he had learned to read very well in a year of paying close attention. "What is it?" he asked. She looked at him, and her face was everything at once, uncertain and radiant and a little frightened and deeply happy. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He stood in the kitchen doorway and felt the information settle into him, spreading warmth through every part of him that had been cold for so long. "When?" he managed. "Spring," she said. "April, I think." He crossed the room and sat down beside her at the table and took both her hands in both of his and looked at her face, which was watching him carefully for his reaction. "Harrison," she said, a little anxiously. "I am trying," he said, "to find the right words for how I feel about this." She watched him. "I do not think there are words that are large enough," he said finally. Her face broke open into a smile so wide and pure it was like sunlight. Clara, who had apparently been listening from the hallway, appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I heard," she announced. Olivia turned. "Clara, is there really going to be a baby?" Clara asked, with an expression that suggested she had already decided how she felt about this, and it was favorable. "There is," Olivia confirmed. Clara came to the table and climbed into her chair with great purpose. She looked at Harrison with her father's seriousness and her mother's open warmth. "I would like a brother," she said, "but a sister would also be acceptable." Harrison looked at his daughter and at his wife, and at the small warm kitchen in the house that had been cold before they came into it. And he thought about all the roads that had led here, the grief and the loss and the walls he had built, and a small hand on his gun hand in a dusty saloon, and everything that had followed from that single unrepeatable moment of grace. He put his arm around Olivia and reached across and took Clara's hand too, and they sat at the table, the three of them. And outside the October evening came down over Dry Creek in its long West Texas way, wide and full of stars. The winter passed with the particular sweetness of a winter when you are expecting something. Olivia's dressmaking business had grown to the point where she had more work than she wanted, and she had begun turning away the less interesting commissions, which Harrison took as a sign of a woman who had fully arrived somewhere and knew it. She was also, it became clear, a woman who nested when expecting, a quality that expressed itself in the thorough reorganization of every room in the house, and a sustained project involving curtains that Harrison participated in by holding things at heights she could not comfortably reach and offering his opinion when asked, which was rarely but genuinely. Clara went through a phase in late January of asking Harrison every question she had ever had all at once, a project that kept their evenings busy. Why did horses have manes? Why was the law written down? Why did the wind come from the west most of the time? Why had he become a sheriff? That last one he answered honestly, because she had asked it honestly, and she was old enough for it. He told her about Catherine, simply and directly, the way he would have wanted someone to tell him something difficult. He told her that Catherine had died, and that he had been very sad for a long time, and that coming to Dry Creek had been his way of trying to keep going when he was not sure he wanted to. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting, which was notable. When he was done she said, "And then we came." "And then you came," he confirmed. She reached over and patted his hand. "I am glad we came," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than you know." The baby was born on the 7th of April, 1882, in the back bedroom of the Ketterman house, which nobody called the Ketterman house anymore but simply called home. Dr. Price, who attended births in Dry Creek with no-nonsense efficiency, pronounced both mother and child healthy and perfect. The baby was a boy. He was 8 pounds and he had Harrison's dark hair and Olivia's wide eyes, and he cried with a vigor that Dr. Price called a good sign, and that Clara, when she was allowed in to see him, announced was very loud. Harrison held his son for the first time with the careful reverence of a man who understood exactly what he was holding and did not take it lightly. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused, absolute attention of the newly arrived, and Harrison felt something complete. Not the completion that follows accomplishment, but the completion of a shape, the last piece of something finding its place. What shall we call him? Olivia asked from the bed, watching him hold the baby with an expression of such complete and settled happiness that it was its own answer to every question. Harrison looked at the boy in his arms. He thought about his father and about Catherine and about all the people who had been before. He thought about the strange path that had brought him here, which he would not trade for any easier road. "Thomas," he said, after nobody in particular, just because it suits him. Olivia smiled. "Thomas," she repeated, trying it. "Yes, it does suit him." Clara climbed up beside her mother on the bed with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it all her life, and peered at her brother with the intense evaluating expression of someone taking on a significant new responsibility. "Hello, Thomas," she said, very seriously. Thomas made a sound. Clara looked up with enormous eyes. "He answered," she said. Harrison looked at his daughter, at his wife, at the boy in his arms, and felt the warmth of it radiating through him, steady and certain, the warmth of a man who has come all the way in from the cold. Thomas learned to sleep through the night by May, which was a development celebrated in the household with the enthusiasm, generally reserved for major civic events. He had Harrison's serious eyes and Olivia's capacity for expression, which meant that every thought and feeling he had was absolutely visible on his face at all times, a quality that Harrison found both endearing and faintly alarming, because he had never been entirely sure how to function without the armor of inscrutability, and he was now raising a child who appeared to be constitutionally incapable of wearing one. Clara took her role as older sister with complete dedication. She instructed Thomas on a wide variety of subjects, whether he was ready for them or not, and reported his progress to Harrison and Olivia with the careful seriousness of someone filing official documents. Summer came again, and then fall, and the rhythms of the household and the town settled around one another the way things did when they were right. Dry Creek was still Dry Creek, still a small, hard-working place at the edge of everything, still held together by the things small towns were held together by, necessity and proximity, and the slow accumulation of shared history. Harrison still wore his badge, and still enforced the law with the same careful integrity he always had. But the coldness that had once been the dominant quality of his public self had been replaced by something that was still quiet and still direct, but had a different quality. The people of Dry Creek felt it. Men who had once found him unapproachable now came to him with problems they needed help thinking through. Families who had once avoided his eye now greeted him by name. He was still not a man given to large gestures or complicated speech. He still did not use 3 words where one would do. But the one word he used had warmth in it now, and the town had noticed. Ned Carver, who had worked beside him for 4 years, and had watched the whole transformation with the quietly delighted affection of someone who had known the before and the after, told him one afternoon with remarkable directness, "You are a different man, boss." Harrison considered this. "Yes," he said, "I am." Ned nodded as if this confirmed something he had been compiling for some time. "Better," he added. "Thank you, Ned," Harrison said. "Olivia did that," Ned said. "Olivia and Clara," Harrison said. "Clara started it." Ned looked interested. "How?" Harrison thought about the saloon in October of 1880. The gun, the silence, the small hand that had rested on his without fear. He thought about how entirely it had undone him and how long it had taken him to understand that being undone was what he had needed. "She reached for my hand," he said simply. "When she had no reason to." Ned thought about this for a moment. "And you did not know what to do with that," he said. "No," Harrison agreed. "I did not at first, but he knew now." He knew it in the particular way that he knew everything that mattered, completely, without reservation, with the kind of certainty that came not from argument, but from being lived into. He went home that evening as the sun was going down over the flat West Texas horizon in all its extravagant color, and Clara was on the front porch with Thomas, who at 6 months old was sitting with her help and looking at the world with enormous, interested eyes. Olivia was in the kitchen, and the lamp was lit in the window, and the smell of supper was in the air, and the whole picture of it was so simple and so complete that he stopped at the gate for a moment just to look at it. Clara saw him and lifted Thomas's small arm to wave it. Thomas looked in the direction Clara was pointing and seemed to register something promising. Harrison pushed open the gate and walked up the path to his front porch and sat on the step beside his daughter and his son and looked at the same sunset they were looking at. Clara leaned against his arm. Thomas made a purposeful noise. "Long day?" Clara asked, in the tone she had absorbed from her mother. "Good day," Harrison said. She leaned a little more. "Papa," she said. "Yes." "I was thinking," she said, with the air of someone who had been thinking very carefully, "that next spring maybe we could get a dog." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those enormous eyes, steady and hopeful and absolutely unafraid, the same way she had looked at him the first time, over a drawn gun in a dusty saloon with her small hand resting on his. He thought about the long closed years and the cold they had contained. He thought about the warmth that had followed one particular morning, then another, then more, until warmth was the weather he lived in and cold was something he could barely remember the feel of. He thought about what it meant that a child had trusted him before he trusted himself. That she had seen something in him worth reaching for when he was entirely sure there was nothing left to reach for. A dog, he said. Brown, Clara said, with a white ear. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Thomas sat between them in the sunset like a small, very serious person at the beginning of everything. "We will see," Harrison said, which was what he said when the answer was yes and he was not ready to say so yet, and Clara knew it perfectly well. She smiled her mother's smile, deep and certain and full of warmth. Inside, Olivia was humming something low and private, the same something he had heard through a window that October evening when he was still telling himself that the window frame was the reason he kept coming back. He listened to it now and recognized it, finally, for what it was. It was home. He was in it, all of it. The sound of her voice and the small, warm weight of his daughter against his side, and the new life in Thomas's wide-open eyes, and the sunset going on forever over the flat West Texas country, and all the roads he had walked to arrive at exactly this porch, this evening, this ordinary, extraordinary moment. He was in it. He was home. Thomas made another sound, this one more definitive, and reached out one small fist and closed it around Harrison's finger with the absolute unconscious certainty of the very young, who reach for warmth without thinking because warmth is what they know the world contains. Harrison held his son's grip and thought of Clara's hand on his in the saloon, and his wife's hand across a kitchen table, and all the hands that had pulled him back into the life he had not known he was still capable of. He closed his eyes for one moment, the West Texas sun red behind his eyelids, and he felt it all. "Thank you," he said very quietly to no one and everyone. Clara looked up at him, curious. "For what?" He opened his eyes. He looked at her. "For reaching for my hand," he said. "A long time ago." She did not understand the full weight of what he meant, but she understood the feeling of it, because she had always understood feelings before she understood reasons, and she smiled at him with the open, uncomplicated love of someone who had decided, at 4 years old in a dusty saloon, that this man was worth trusting. "You looked like you needed it," she said. He did. He had. And the cold, closed, careful man he had been was gone for good, replaced by someone warm and present and completely accounted for. A husband and a father and a sheriff. A man with a home and a future, and a daughter who had found him before he found himself. Dry Creek settled into its evening around them, lamp by lamp, the stars coming out one by one over the enormous Texas sky, and Harrison Odell sat on his porch with his children in the warm last light of a day that had been worth having, waiting for his wife to call them in to supper, and the waiting itself was sweet. The spring they had promised Clara, they got a dog, brown with one white ear. His name, by unanimous and uncontested agreement, was Captain.